My name is Rob Soames, and this talk is about an 18th century Freemason named Laurence Dermott. About 5 years ago, like many Freemasons nowadays, I had hardly heard of him. But the Deputy Metropolitan Grand Superintendent, excellent companion Chris Clark, asked me to do some research. The outcome is this publication, Laurence Dermott, Enigma and Trailblazer. Enigma, yes, because it is strange that someone who our research shows probably did more than any other person to develop English Freemasonry is so little known now. And Trailblazer? Well, listen to the story and make up your own mind. So who was Laurence Dermott? He was an Irishman, born in 1720, and he died in London in 1791. He seems to have been illegitimate, and it looks as if he had a bit of a chip on his shoulder against those who had an easier upbringing. He was typically a genial, hail fellow, well-met, hard-drinking kind of Mason. We don't know what he looked like. No portrait exists. He was a family man, a real leader in difficult times, a superb lodge secretary and administrator, and a writer and popularizer of Masonry. He was also an artist, and especially as he got older, an irascible, gout-stricken stickler for Masonic detail and obscure protocol. Quite a mix-up. Why should we be interested? I and the team who produced the Met biography have come to think that a large part of the Freemasonry that we enjoy today only exists because of what he did. Without Laurence Dermott, it is even possible that Masonry might not have survived into the 20th century. Certainly not as the large, charitably inclined organisation for all kinds and types of mankind that we are nowadays. So how did it all happen? Ireland in the early 18th century was very poor, and the English in charge in Dublin tended to discriminate against the Irish generally, and encouraged by the law, against the Roman Catholic Irish especially. So those Irish emigrated and came to London, as did Laurence. As I said earlier, it seems likely he was illegitimate. We can't find any evidence of a mother or a marriage certificate or his baptism certificate, though not having this is not conclusive proof. His father was a merchant in Dublin, and he seems to have been illegitimate too. But his father, Laurence's grandfather, had been very successful by the Irish standards of the day, but having both son and grandson illegitimate would have meant that they didn't inherit the MacDermott family wealth. There was a legitimate son who did that. And this probably explains why Laurence left for London. What he did get from the MacDermotts was a pretty good basic education. In Ireland, there has long been a tradition that he was an apprentice of one of the big, well, I suppose we'd call it a building, construction and home improvements firm. This makes sense because the man who came to London in 1748 described himself later as a journeyman painter. He had other skills too, as an engraver, and it soon became clear, a persuasive speaker, a writer, and an administrator. Significantly for our story, he had become a Mason in Ireland probably just before his 21st birthday. Though later MacDermotts in Ireland became Masons, it looks as if Laurence was the first, and although it can't be proved, it seems logical to suppose that he became a Mason through his friends and colleagues and contacts in Dublin in the construction firm. In 1739, going to 1740, there was an horrendous frost and famine in Ireland, and I wonder if he became a Mason just as everything was falling apart. We have problems now, but it is estimated that 1 million people of an Irish population of less than 2.5 million died at this time. And no one in England took any notice at all. And that's probably why you've never heard of the Great Frost, although I suspect you do know about the Great Potato Famine 100 years later. Dermott became Worshipful Master of Irish Lodge number 26 on the 24th of June 1746. In the same year, he was also exalted into a Royal Arch Chapter. I ought to mention here that Irish Masonry seems to have been much more an activity for ordinary lower, middle and middle class men in Ireland than it was in London, where it was the nobility and the leading citizens who tended to be Masons. This distinction matters, as in England, one of the main differences between the ancients and the 1717 Grand Lodge was the social mix of membership. At first, Laurence Dermott lived in the very poorest parts of London, in Hackney. We're now just over a third through his life, but his English life definitely falls into two halves. For 20 years he was the secretary of what became known as the Ancients' Grand Lodge. Then he retired, and from 1771 until pretty well his death, he was the Deputy Grand Master. By the time Laurence died in 1791, he'd been out of the limelight for many years, and it is probably part of the reason why, years later, in 1813, when the two Grand Lodges eventually amalgamated and became the United Grand Lodge of England, that Dermott and the role that he'd played earlier were completely forgotten. 1813 is 22 years after his death, and 42 years since he'd been Grand Secretary. How well do you remember 1978? Those influential in 1770, if they were still alive, would have been very old. Life had moved on. There were the Napoleonic Wars. The Industrial Revolution was in full flow. Dermott was forgotten. This is the reason why we have mostly forgotten how important he is to Masonry. The early 1750s were a time of frustration and irritation amongst many ordinary Masons in England, and especially London, where the Irish immigrant Masons lived. The original English Grand Lodge, set up in 1717, had made changes, modernised, you might say, in ways that didn't meet their needs. It seemed to them to have lost its way. And they also found the English were disinterested and unfriendly. In 1751, they set up their own separate coordinating organisation, and almost immediately the young and energetic Laurence Dermott became its second Grand Secretary, and his drive, hard work, determination and administrative flair quickly turned this small grouping of lodges into an effective and distinctive organisation which others wanted to join. The 1717 Grand Lodge ignored them. Pretty soon, though, they could ignore them no longer. By 1756, the new Grand Lodge, which was dubbed the Ancients, because they said they had maintained the old ways as opposed to the 1717 Grand Lodge, which was therefore the moderns, had all the attributes of an English Grand Lodge. They had a noble Grand Master. They had their own book of constitutions, which Dermott wrote, published, and he called it mysteriously the Enigma and Trailblazer. They had formal relations with the Irish and Scottish Grand Lodges, and members across England, and through their military and naval membership, members in places like North America as well. Dermott by then no longer had much time for painting, as he was very active, visiting, educating and mentoring lodges. He took a fee for the copies of Enigma and Trailblazer which were sold, and he issued warrant and certificate documents for which he also charged a fee. But he was known as a man of his word, incorruptible, honest in approach in his financial dealings. He was also a hard taskmaster amongst those of his colleagues assisting with Masonic protocol. During the 1760s, the Ancients continued to expand. Enigma and Trailblazer was revised and reissued, and the spat with the 1717 Grand Lodge became worse. By 1770, Dermott's health was less good. He suffered badly from gout, and it seems very likely that the pain of gout must have increasingly affected his judgment. He stood down as Grand Secretary and became Deputy Grand Master. He continued to take a close interest in the Ancients Grand Lodge throughout the 1780s, but towards the end he was less involved. His personal life is interesting, especially if you recall what I said about his early years. He had bettered himself materially over the years, though he had, as was certainly common in those days, a fair amount of sorrow and hardship to put up with. Our researchers have showed that he had 3 daughters with a Susanna Neale between 1753 and 1757. Only the last daughter survived, and indeed survived to look after her father in his old age. But Susanna and he married only in January 1759, and Susanna died in December 1764. Research suggests that during the 1750s she may have had a husband living. In 1765 he married again, but that lady, the widow of a tavern keeper where the Grand Lodge usually met, died soon afterwards. And then later, in 1766, he remarried the widow of an eminent wine merchant. By this time, he was described in the newspapers as a vintner. Perhaps it isn't surprising that he suffered from gout. He had a son of this marriage, but the lad died aged 3. Elizabeth, his 3rd wife, survived him. His reputation for being a difficult man to get on with has appeared in stories about him. But maybe he did indeed have good grounds for reacting in the way that he did. His background in Ireland made him aware how badly his fellow countrymen were treated, first in Ireland and then when he settled in London too. And in addition, his less than strictly conventional family situation may have led to him being circumspect about his personal circumstances. Had the Ancients not had such an energetic and competent secretary, it is doubtful that they would have survived the first few years, let alone flourished. Later, it is pretty clear that his younger contemporaries found him very difficult to work with. But they recognised his huge contribution and knew that without him the ancients would not have survived or flourished. Maybe the numbers tell us most. In 1789 there were 258 ancient lodges, of which 50 were in North America. One theme that does come through, which we think has not been fully identified before, is that it's clear that Dermott focused on Masonic charity and ensured that monies collected were then dispensed properly to the benefit of those in financial and other difficulties. No doubt everyone benefited from his good administration and unchallenged probity too, and this perhaps is why, because of his essentially charitable and generous nature, the brethren put up with him even when he became rather difficult to do so. In the 19th century, it was probably too soon to take much interest in Laurence Dermott, and anyway, some aspects of his story might not have appealed to what I might call Victorian sensibilities. There was some interest in the 1880s, but until recently no one had really looked again at the sources evidence. We think it reveals an interesting and a fresh story, and I hope this talk will encourage you to find out more. So finally, if you'd like a copy of the book, it is an official publication of the Metropolitan Grand Chapter under the United Grand Lodge of England. It is normally available through the Met Grand Office at Freemasons Hall in London. But you may like to use the comment box below. Thank you for listening.